So I know it's been a few weeks since I've been able to post one of these. I've been in and out a lot. I will continue to be in September. But it is fun to be able to kind of turn over the community to other members to lead in worship, to lead in prayer, to remember that we are, in fact, a community, that we all have things to teach, we all have things to learn, we are all perfectly capable of, hosting people in God's presence. So this week I was around, and there's been a lot of talk about prayer. There's been a lot of practice of prayer. And so I thought I would look at a psalm together that has a lot to teach us about just kind of our attitudes of prayer and how important they are. So we're going to look at Psalm 46 together. And Psalm 46 has kind of a central metaphor of a storm of violence, of just kind of the raging powers of the natural world, whether that's water or storms, that sort of thing, used in a few different ways. So before I read this, I want us to take just 1 second to ask ourselves, what feels stormy? What feels out of control? What feels violent in our lives right now? Are we feeling out of control with maybe our work situation? Maybe it's relationships in general, or a relationship with a specific person we're just not getting along with. Maybe it's something bigger, more societal, frustration with politics or the systems in the world, and how degrading and how frustrating and how beyond our control they are. Maybe it's something within, just a piece of ourselves we don't like right now, or we wish, felt easier to control. It isn't what we want it to be. Whatever kind of the first thing that comes to your mind is, whatever feels stormy and out of control, maybe it's even all of those things. Take just kind of a second to identify that in your own mind. And as we're reading this, listen to all the kind of chaos, listen to all the kind of storminess, and keep this real world situation of yours in mind as I read this and what God's response is to it in a lot of ways. God is a shelter and a strength for us, a help in straits readily found. Therefore we fear not when the earth breaks apart, when mountains collapse in the heart of the seas. Its waters roar and roil, mountains heave in its surge. Selah. A stream, its rivulets gladden God's town, the holy dwelling of Elyon. God is in its midst, it will not collapse. God helps it as morning breaks. Nations roar, kingdoms collapse. He sends his voice, and the earth melts. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God. Selah. Go, behold the acts of the Lord, who made desolations on earth, caused wars to cease to the end of the earth. The bow he has broken and splintered the spear, and chariots burned to fire. Let go and know that I am God. I loom among the nations, I loom upon the earth. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God. So the kind of poetic feel of this psalm is it's going to give us a couple different times kind of these statements that almost work like kind of a rock or a cliff face in the midst of this storm, and then we're going to let different aspects of this storm kind of wash against this place of safety that these rocks come. So first we get looking at those kind of rocks that we'll see throughout these pillars, these places of safety. One is in 2 that works as a refrain in this. God is a shelter and a strength for us, a help in straits, readily found. Then we get another one in verse 8. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God. And then it ends again on those exact same thing. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God. And in between, we're going to look at a couple different things of this storm. Again, remembering, what is your storm right now? What is your place of chaos that you need God to be speaking into? Because this is, again, his response to us all throughout time, not just those who originally wrote this. So the first kind of storm we get described, this eschatological storm of the world itself breaking apart. which is often how it feels, right? We feel out of control. We feel like everything is shredding and breaking apart, that destruction lives in whatever that area is that you're feeling right now, that whatever is chaos, right? I think this is a pretty apt description for that part of my life. Therefore, we fear not when the earth breaks apart, when mountains collapse in the heart of the seas. Its waters roar and roil, mountains heave in its surge. So the first thing we get, of course, is the chaos swirling around, right? But we're told right before that God is a shelter. Therefore, we're not afraid of everything breaking apart, though we have a lot of reason to be afraid if those things are true. And then we switch. If God is a shelter, and here is the raging storm outside, we get the description of the shelter itself in the midst of this storm, this chaos, this world falling completely apart. We get a very different use of water. There's a stream. Its rivulets gladden God's town, the holy dwelling of all Yon, which is an old title meaning Most High, God Most High. God is in its midst. It will not collapse. God helps it as morning breaks. So we get a very different use of water, right? If water in the first part is mountains are collapsing into the heart of the sea, if waters are rolling and roiling, now we have a different reminder of what else water can be. Water here is a stream, a rivulet gladdening, giving people sustenance and refreshment and drink. Why? Because God's presence is there in the midst of the storm, protecting from its ultimate danger and those sorts of things. And yet we get a glimpse of it, and then we're going to return outside and we're going to change metaphors or change about what we're talking about. But the storm is still raging outside of the shelter, right? So this time it's military, this time it's political, this time it's violence itself that is roaring against God's people. Nations roar, kingdoms collapse. He sends forth his voice, and the earth melts, because the Lord of armies is with us. A fortress for us is Jacob's God. So it's quick, the metaphor changes, right? The first time in the storm, it's a shelter. Now, if there are armies about, if we're being attacked, if the military is there to harm us with violence, now God is a fortress. And then this next section goes into after the storm has come, it's raged as much as it can. After these armies have broken against this fortress, we get this description, again, a beautiful one of what God is promising will happen kind of at the end of all time, at the end of all of this violence, at the end of these storms that we've been looking at and thinking about. Go behold the acts of the Lord, who's made desolations on the earth, caused wars to cease to the end of the earth. The bow he's broken and splintered the spear, and chariots are burned in fire. So whether it's violence, whether it's this a water, a literal storm, in the end, it's going to wash over and it's going to be broken, and there's a desolation. The damage is real, but there is something completely beyond it in what we see here. And then finally at this point in the psalm, we hear God's voice. Let go, or be still, and know that I'm God. I loom among nations. I loom upon the earth. And this phrase of letting go, being still, I think we can take in a couple different directions. In this psalm, it's talking to, I think, all the powers in the world, all the powers of chaos, but I think it's also talking to us as well, right? There are times when we see what is in the world, probably even times when we're thinking about whatever our example is right now, whatever storm is going on in our life, right? We feel anxious. We feel like there's something we need to do. We need to get rid of this. We need to fix it. We need to get rid of this feeling, right? And to both the external problems, both the internal problems, God is saying the very same thing. Let go. Be still. Stop this anxious activity. Stop trying, if it's the case of, these storms themselves, stop trying to attack me. Stop trying to get at my people. Just knock it off. Hush. I've heard as a translation before too, right? It's the exact same thing that Jesus says when he is riding a boat in the midst of a storm, which is probably modeled on this psalm as well, the way the story is told, I mean, right? Hush, be still, let go, because God is in charge. God is looming with those things. And this verse particularly, be still and know that I am God, right, is another very famous verse to lift out. It's a very popular verse among kind of spiritual formation. People reminding us we do need to stop just this addiction to activity that we have. We need to be still. We need to sit in God's silence. We need to just trust God at times. So I think that is an accurate an important lesson, especially for us in our hyperactive culture, where we have to do to be value all the time. And so I think that's not the original. That's not the original kind of language. It's not the original meaning of those verses. But I think it's an accurate use. I think the Holy Spirit has guided that kind of common use. But whereas a lot of spiritual formation is pulling back, right? Stepping out of our normal routines to be quiet with God, to be silent, to trust. This psalm is offering the exact same thing, but in a very different setting, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the world, in the midst of violence and things not making sense. The invitation to prayer, the invitation to trust, is not one to step out of circumstances to make that possible, but right in the midst of the storm, to trust because of who God is. And this fits overall with the way I think God does things. I made reference to earlier, Jesus calming this storm. Again, I think a passage that is based very heavily on this psalm and other ones like it. Jesus was God. He knew perfectly well a storm was coming, and yet he got into the boat. He let himself and the disciples go into the midst of it. He even took a nap, right? He trusted that the storm, the chaos, the fear, the violence of the thing was not going to overwhelm him. And so he says those exact same things again. Be calm, be still. And the storm calmed away, right? It's the same thing. God could have stayed in heaven, and yet Jesus came, became a person, and all the limitations and all the weaknesses that implies. He lived among us, experienced life among us. And the ultimate storm is, of course, humanity's response to God. The cross. We killed him. And yet death, sin, pain, darkness, all the things that are foreign to the way God made the world, they threw everything they had at him in the ultimate storm. And he resurrected. He brought life. He brought a path to a new kingdom, a new way of being in the world that will extend into eternity, right? And so whereas we can want to just simply snap our fingers, we wish we could say hush to the storms in our life a lot of the time too, right? And yet, as his followers, I suspect we need to follow God the same way. We need to go where we're willing. We need to shelter in the midst of the storm, not try to step out of the storms all the time. And the reason that is possible, the reason that works, is not because we are so strong, not because we are so spiritual, but because of what it says here, right? Let go, be still, and know that I'm God, not you. You don't have enough, but I do. And I love the imagery. I'm going to loom among the nations. I'm going to loom around the earth. It's like the image of this giant looking down at this thing that feels so big and terrible and out of control for us. It's just bending down to even take a peek at it, right? And so I think this passage, and particularly whatever storms are going on in our life, no matter how big, no matter how small, there is something to be said about God's presence in the midst of the storm, of being still, of trusting, of experiencing his presence in that shelter described in the middle, right? As the storm rages around us. Because the promise is that storm, that violence, is not as powerful as it thinks it is. It does not have enough to take down God in his presence. And so, again, I want to look at this one last time. I'm going to read through the entire thing. What is the storm in your life right now? Because God is not promising a life of peace, not a life of rest, and that all your problems are going to go away. Not yet. But God is promising that he will be your shelter, your presence, your refreshment in the midst of the storm, not because you are so spiritual, not because you are so strong, but because he is. And so let's listen to this storm in all its forms, rage against God. Let's listen to what it feels like to be resting in his presence. And at the end, let's do our best to trust God, to trust and still and to let go, knowing who God is and how he can handle those storms. So to your storm, whatever that situation is right now, God says, God is a shelter and a strength for us, a help in straits readily found. Therefore we fear not when the earth breaks apart, when mountains collapse in the heart of the seas, when waters roar and roil, mountains heave in its surge, a stream, its rivulets gladden God's town, the holy dwelling of Elyon. God in its midst, it will not collapse. God helps it as morning breaks. Nations roar, kingdoms collapse, and he sends his voice and the earth melts. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God. Go, behold the acts of the Lord, who made desolations on earth, caused wars to cease in the end of the earth. The bow he has broken and splintered the spear, the chariots burned in fire. Let go and know that I am God. I loom among nations, I loom upon earth. The Lord of armies is with us, a fortress for us, Jacob's God.